stuff of fairy tales. Fantastical creatures that ride broomsticks and cast spells over bubbling cauldrons. But back in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Tudors and Stuarts ruled, everyone thought they were terrifying fact. For 200 years, we were so scared of witches, the church and state became hell-bent on exterminating them. Across Europe, more than 40,000 innocent people were put to death. These horrific witch hunts were one of the darkest and bloodiest periods in our history. I want to find out exactly what the word witch meant to our ancestors. Where did they come from? What harm did they do? And how on earth could you stop them? To get the answers, I'm going to investigate a case study from the many thousands documented in contemporary court records. I've chosen Agnes Sampson, a Scottish midwife believed to be the inspiration for Shakespeare's witches in Macbeth. In 1590, Agnes was accused of trying to murder King James VI of Scotland with black magic. Her spells were thought to have conjured up a terrible storm that nearly sank his ship. I hope her story will reveal why our ancestors were so convinced witchcraft was real. Helping me in my quest is historian Dr. Lawrence Normand.
She was right at the centre of one of the most spectacular witch hunts in Scotland, the so-called North Berwick witch hunt in 1590. And she was supposed to have gathered with some other witches, about 200 in North Berwick Kirk, and plotted to kill King James and also his wife, Queen Anne. And that was the centre of a big kind of plot against the king.
So did they think she had powers?
Yes, I mean, it was those who were accusing her of witchcraft thought that she had made a pact with the devil. And in doing that, she'd acquired demonic powers, devilish powers.
When you say she was in league with the devil, what did that mean?
Not only did the devil give them supernatural powers that they could do all sorts of extraordinary things, but that they had the power to destroy. They could kill your children, they could destroy your livestock, give you diseases. They were a very feared set of people.
So our ancestors believed that witches weren't born with their terrible powers. They were ordinary women who had been tempted to the dark side by the devil himself. This meant your wife, daughter, or sister could easily become one. Professor Malcolm Gaskell is going to reveal how this diabolic transformation was thought to take place.
Well, the way in which accused witches sometimes do describe their first meetings with the devil is that they're going about their business and, yes, he suddenly appears, often in a kind of a rural setting like this.
It was believed that the devil could travel in the form of smoke or mist and then morph into any disguise he wanted. Why would respectable, upright women like Agnes have fallen for the devil?
The devil, you know, we think of as a very frightening being, and of course people were frightened of him. But then to those who possibly were powerless, like women, especially poor women, that he was also something rather attractive about him. And it wasn't just attractive that he was presenting with a kind of business proposition. He was actually often described as an attractive man who would come to you like a sexual suitor.
What did he do once he'd got one of these women on side?
What the devil would try and do is sweet talk the candidate that he's identified into coming over to his side. So he might point out the inadequacy of the candidate's life and say, you know, you're living a life of absolute poverty, you know, I could make you richer. You're living a life of powerlessness, I can give you power. Once he'd found a willing convert, then he would look to kind of seal the deal, and that meant fixing a covenant or a contract or a pact with the individual.
Court records reveal that the most horrific aspect of the diabolic pact was thought to be when the devil mated with his new recruit. This whole 16th century fantasy revolved around women exchanging their virtue for power from hell.
You've got to remember, of course, that this is all about inversion. So the devil is like the opposite of a good husband. And this is the witch giving herself intimately to her new master. The witch has often described that the devil is cold, his body is cold, and even that his semen is icy cold. Of course, what it symbolises is the witch now, she's committed a crime against the government, she's committed a crime against the church and religion.
In this nightmare fantasy, sex with the devil would transform women like Agnes into terrifying witches. But they'd be impossible to spot, as outwardly they'd look absolutely normal. Professor Marion Gibson explains.
The woman next door to you could be a witch. The woman in the same house as you could be a witch. And you wouldn't know she was exactly like other women. But on the inside, she might be very, very evil.
What kind of evil things did they do that were actually quite ordinary?
They did all kinds of things. They would use ordinary tools, like this knife, for example. Witches might plunge this into the wall in order to be able to milk their neighbours' cows. They would plunge the knife in and then milk it in order to draw the milk into their own home.
Domestic implements were believed to be at the heart of the witch's arsenal. They could supposedly be transformed into tools of the occult by using the most shocking ingredients.
The way that they would have made this simple broomstick into an implement that could fly would involve the grinding up of bones, of babies, of murdered children, and the reducing of this to this kind of goopy fat. And they would smear this onto the broomstick, and because of it, this was a demonic and unnatural activity, the killing of children and boiling of their bones, this magic would make the broomstick fly.
Why do you think they chose the image of a broomstick?
It's a household implement which is available to everybody. That seems to have been one of the reasons why these came up so often in the stories. It also is a complete inversion of what a housewife is supposed to be doing with a broomstick. Instead of cleaning the house with it, it's a means of corruption and pollution and wickedness generally, just as the baby's bones are about the anti-maternal.
This is the world turned upside down, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, this is exactly all the things that a woman should not be doing.
But Agnes wasn't thought to be performing black magic alone. Witches were believed to combine forces at diabolic meetings. These terrifying celebrations of the dark arts were known as witches' sabbaths. Using court records, Marion and Malcolm are going to show me what they were thought to involve. Malcolm, what would have people started doing once they got here?
They would start to dance around the fire and they would be feasting and celebrating. It's like a kind of it's been described as like a perverted village fair.
But what was it that scared people so much about all this?
Well, of course, witches have come here to pay homage to their master Satan, to plot their foul crimes against their neighbours. There really is the dark side of religion. They have come here to do something terrible. It's like a big black mass, so it's actually it's heretical and atheistical meeting as well. So all those things that are precious to order in society are being attacked and undermined.
Inversion, transforming everything good into its dark, demonic opposite, was believed to be at the heart of the Sabbath. Anything wholesome would be made foul. A healthy stew would become an evil concoction designed to harm rather than nourish.
In plays like Macbeth, Shakespeare, for example, imagines people putting in bits of tiger and baboon's blood and so on.
So hubble, bubble, toil and trouble really was part of what they thought witches did?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, anything that was out of the ordinary, that was obscene or erotic or exotic, that would all go on at the Sabbath.
Popular religious festivals and celebrations would also be inverted at the Sabbath, becoming a hellish travesty, with participants supposedly dancing backwards.
It's back to back, it's hip to hip, it's inversion, it's disorder, all the kind of things that the early modern world was very suspicious of.
This is everything that was decent and orderly and proper in society turned on its head and turned backwards.
But the main target of mockery was Christianity itself. Its rituals were subverted, so the devil became the object of worship, and all manner of sacrilegious acts would take place. The climax of the Sabbath came when the witches once again pledged allegiance to their satanic master.
They would kiss the devil's arse. This was the so-called shameful kiss, the unclean kiss, the osculum infame. In the case of Agnes Sampson, we have an account where the devil supposedly hangs his arse over the sides of the pulpit so the witches can, to really get in there and really give him a good snog, yeah. What the devil's kiss, the unclean kiss does is it turns everything on its head, social norms, political norms and religious norms as well. Of course, this is the Black Mass. This is an absolute mockery of everything that's good and holy about the church. And through this really foul sexual act, all those things that can come together.
It's difficult to imagine quite how shocking all this would have been to people around here at the time. But it would have been about as bad as it could get. It mocked and attacked everything that they held dear, a bit like desecrating a grave or something. And even today, there's something about it that makes you feel quite uncomfortable, isn't there? Of course, none of this really happened. But this is what our Tudor and Stuart ancestors firmly believed was going on in secret. Women like Agnes were supposedly turning their backs on everything good and exchanging their faith and virtue for powers from hell. Witches were a threat to everything that 16th century Britain held dear, and it was the moral weakness of women which was at the heart of this fear. These guardians of chastity and family values and faith could be tempted to the dark side. And that meant that your mother or your sister or your wife or even you could fall. And that was a terrifying prospect. But the question is, why did our ancestors believe that this nightmare scenario was real? I'm about to find out why our ancestors were convinced magic was fact rather than fiction, and how practicing the black arts became punishable by death.
At Wickes, there are some great savings, including 3 for 2 on Wickes and Dulux paint. Hurry, offers end Monday 21st of April. Wickes.
Desperation to exterminate them. One of these was Agnes Sampson, a midwife convicted of trying to kill King James VI of Scotland with black magic. I've discovered what witches were feared to do, but now I want to know why everyone took this fantasy so seriously. Imagine I'm your average Tudor bloke, decent, hard-working chap, just trying to make an honest living on my small holding. I've got a couple of pigs in the shed, I've got a few sheep on the common, and I've got my chickens. But look at this. This one has definitely pegged it. I don't understand it. She was right as rain this morning. I even had one of her eggs for breakfast. And now, all of a sudden, boom, she's dead. And there isn't a mark on her. The foxes haven't had her. The gate's locked, no one's broken in. And I definitely fed her this morning, honest. For 16th century man, there was one obvious conclusion. Someone in this village is a bloody witch. Our Tudor ancestors' obsession with witchcraft grew out of a long-standing belief in all forms of magic, stretching back to Roman times and beyond. By the Middle Ages, magic was such a popular way to deal with everyday problems, it had become big business. In towns and villages across the country, so-called cunning folk were doing a roaring trade, selling supernatural solutions for all manner of troubles. Professor Owen Davis is going to give me a taste of what they offered. Good morning.
Good morning.
Owen, how seriously did our medieval ancestors take magic?
Hugely seriously. They're living in a chaotic, unpredictable world, a world full of spirits and fairies and witches. People are constantly trying to make sense of why things happen and why they've happened to them individually.
So there really would have been a sort of one-stop shop where cunning folk like you could have solved all my problems.
Absolutely. They would offer pretty much to do anything for you, apart from raising the dead, as long as you paid for it.
All right, my sister's husband is a bit of a swine, and I think he's been having an affair with someone else.
OK, well, I think we need to cool their ardour. And to do that, I need a lock and a key.
Ah, a lock and a key.
OK, now if you give this to me, using my magic, when I lock the lock, and I take the key out, I need to put them in water.
Here are 2 buckets of water.
That's what we need. So I'm going to put the key in one bucket and the lock in the other. And having done that, the two will never come together.
That'll teach them, won't it? This is a form of sympathetic magic, where objects represent people. Separating the phallic key from the tempting lock would also separate the errant brother-in-law from his mistress. You're transforming my life, but there is one big issue we haven't discussed yet, which is I don't think that my girlfriend fancies me anymore.
Well, it looks like we need to get a magic spell together. And to do that, I need a rose.
Ah, got a rose. Here's a rose.
Perfect. Now, I also need you to give me that consecrated ink. And I will consult my book of magic to find a love charm for you. So I shall write the magic symbol on the charm.
Yeah.
And now I'll give that back to you. And if you strew the petals with the doorway of your beloved, she will love you forever.
The spells of cunning folk were clearly about showmanship and suggestion, rather than manipulating supernatural forces. Clients were encouraged to believe that everyday objects could have magical powers. But does this mean our ancestors were just gullible and naive? Not necessarily. Psychologist Claudia Hammond has gathered a group of rational, skeptical science students to demonstrate that many of us still subconsciously believe. Even in the 21st century, it seems we can't quite bring ourselves to discount the possibility of magic. So it's hardly surprising our ancestors, who inhabited a world much less understood by science, were prepared to believe not just in beneficial magic, but witchcraft and the black arts. And these beliefs were growing in strength and power as academics attempted to give them intellectual credibility. With the arrival of the printing press in the 15th century, their theories began to spread like wildfire. The fear of witches soon reached epidemic proportions.
A lot of it starts with this one book, the Malleus Maleficarum, which means the Hammer of Witches. It was written in Germany in the 1480s by a chap called Heinrich Kramer. He had a collaborator, Jakob Sprenger, as well. So this is 2 Dominican inquisitors. These 2 guys were interested in catching witches, questioning them, indeed torturing them, and then in punishing them. So this is really a kind of handbook which starts that epidemic and then helps to spread it across Europe.
But not many people could read, could they?
No, they couldn't. But this is the kind of book that lots of gentlemen would have had in their private libraries. So the contents of this book would have spread very widely, even to people who couldn't read.
What kind of things does it say?
This is a book focused entirely on female witches. Men are being told that women can actually be having sex with the devil, even while people are standing around them. The devil will be invisible, and this could be happening to your wife while you're watching.
Look at this. At the end of the act, a very black vapour of about the stature of a man rises up into the air from the witch.
Yes.
It's so salacious that it makes us giggly. It's like something out of a tabloid newspaper, isn't it? It's erotic, but it touches on people's genuine fears as well.
Yes, it does. Yes, this is exactly it. This is like a red top newspaper. And you can imagine the same kind of motivations lying behind its publication. My goodness, people will buy this. But at the same time, we have really important knowledge to communicate to them about the devil and his ways in the world.
When printed books like Malleus Maleficarum started to appear, witchcraft became taken increasingly seriously at all levels of society. The church wanted to show it was protecting people by hunting witches down and eradicating them. And it wasn't long before monarchs were anxious to show they were also playing their part. Dr. Susan Duran has tracked down some revealing documents at Westminster Archives. Which monarch does this one relate to?
This monarch is Henry VIII, and you can see here it's the Act Against Conjurations and Witchcrafts, and it's 1542. And it's the first act that makes witchcraft a felony in England.
What does it actually say?
Well, it says here, where diverse and sundry persons unlawfully have devised and practiced invocations and conjurations of spirits, pretending by such means to understand and yet know from their own lucre and, well, it goes on to say, to find treasure, to carry out maleficium, bad practices, harm to their neighbours, to people in the towns, and also, of course, treason against the king.
And what would happen if they did those things?
They would be hanged. At least if they were found guilty, they would be hanged. It's now very much the state's responsibility to safeguard the people who are living in the king's realm from the bad practices of witches.
Did Henry believe this stuff? I mean, whatever we might think of him, he was a very cultured man, wasn't he?
Yes, but it was ingrained in society, the belief in magic. He shared it with very many intellectuals, whether they were members of the church or whether they were secular. He definitely believed in magic.
And we have to be very careful with this document, I know, because it's just so precious. In Scotland, where Agnes Sampson lived, James VI, who was later to become James I of England, enforced several laws, one of which made both witchcraft and keeping company with witches punishable by death. James was pretty obsessed with witches, wasn't he?
He came to be after he went to Denmark, where he had gone in order to marry his new queen, Queen Anne. When he came back, he became particularly engaged with the problem of witchcraft because a storm had almost shipwrecked him and his bride on their return to Scotland. James really became alarmed about this. He saw that there was a connection between his enemies, political enemies, and the powers of witchcraft.
James was told that the storm had been magically raised by a witch who wanted to kill him. He was determined to find and destroy the evil being before she could do any more damage. But there was a problem. Although witches were fearsome, supernatural creatures, they looked perfectly normal. So how could you spot one? I'm about to find out how our ancestors thought you could tell who'd been dancing with the devil, and I'll discover the best way to century ancestors believed witches and black magic weren't fiction, but horrific fact. I've already seen how fear of these women and their supposed supernatural powers permeated all levels of society, up to the king himself. But now I want to discover how people actually dealt with these terrifying supernatural beings. How did they identify them and trap them and put them to death? After all, witches looked completely normal on the outside. So identifying who around you was in league with the devil required a very special set of tests. Professor Malcolm Gaskell is going to demonstrate a particularly brutal one.
What people are trying to do is to get the evidence which they can use, because they're going to have to go to a court of law. So one of the methods which is used is to subject the witch to the so-called ordeal by water.
How did that work?
Well, the idea is that you put the suspected woman into the water, and that if she's innocent, that she would sink, and that if she was guilty, that she would float, because The idea is that this is a pure element, water, and it would actually reject the witch. It's the reverse of the baptismal waters accepting the Christian child.
In Catholic countries, a river or pond might even be blessed so it would become holy water. This would supposedly repel evil, forcing the witch up to the surface.
But she would have been bound with her thumbs to her opposing toes, making the sign of the cross over her body, and also bound so that she couldn't swim to save herself and so spoil the experiment. So all the people from the village who'd had suspicions against the suspect would have come out that day, all eyes focused on the individual in the water to see whether she was indeed a witch or not. Well, people often do float, but there are accounts where people say, well, they floated even though we tried to hold them under the water with poles. There's nothing we could do to make this individual sink. And so that would have really emphasised the guilt of the suspect.
But if she did stay under, she'd just drown.
Yeah, well, people often think that actually you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you sink, then you drown, and then you die anyway.
Yeah.
But actually, you know, these people would be attached to a rope because the idea is you haul them out. You don't want them to drown because that could be murder. What you want to do is prove the guilt, haul her out of the water with the rope, and then use that testimony in a law court against her.
But ordeal by water was just one way to detect a witch. Another was to find the devil's mark. When the devil touched his followers, it was thought his demonic heat would burn them, leaving a scar. This could sometimes take the form of a teat-like appendage used to suckle demons. I'm off to a dermatology clinic to see what sort of blemishes might once have been considered the devil's mark.